When did you first meet Jacinda Ardern?
I knew Jacinda when she was a Member of Parliament, when I was working for Auckland Tourism, Events and Economic Development as the CEO there, and she was a pretty active list MP around Auckland, and took a real interest in the screen sector, which was a sector that's still pretty important to Auckland and was going through a big review at the time, so spent quite a lot of time talking to her about that.
Yeah. And did you think from those times that she had leadership potential?
It was hard to tell, I suppose, because she was very new into politics. She was always a very good communicator and always very engaging. But I remember vividly the day when she became Labour Party leader, and that really took me by surprise, because I guess primarily because she was so young and, into that role, and New Zealand has a tradition of having slightly older political leaders. But obviously her appointment was greeted pretty positively by the public, and at that stage I think she represented a lot of values that New Zealanders thought were important, and so people were willing to sort of focus on the message rather than necessarily whether she was, had the leadership experience to deliver on it.
What do you make of the government's initial response to COVID-19 at the beginning of, what year was it, 2020?
Look, I think, clearly it all happened very quickly. I'd actually been in China in December 2019, and I was there on some film commission business because I was on the film commission board, and also some AT business. And I remember some of my friends in Beijing saying, "Hey, look, we've heard about this bird flu that started in Wuhan, and when you travel back to New Zealand, maybe wear a mask on the plane." Mm-hmm. And so I was aware that that something was happening, and obviously we started to hear more publicity about it. And actually, the day they talked about the fact we were going to be going into some kind of lockdown, we actually had a forum for our members at the EMA. And I said to the members, "Look, don't worry, you'll all have health and safety plans for dealing with something like this, just trust your plans." Little realising that actually most New Zealand businesses had no plans for a pandemic because it was, something that was so unusual.
Yeah.
And I think the initial response was pretty professional. You had, it utilised the same kind of resources and processes that you'd expect in a civil defence emergency or something like that. You had a lot of highly experienced people who had people like Mike Bush and Peter Crabtree, who was an old colleague of mine, who brought that team together. You had the emergency centre activated in the Beehive, and actually business was welcomed into that. So we had a couple of people from Business New Zealand who, were the parent body, or if you like, of the EMA, who were embedded. And I myself, as the CEO of the EMA, the largest business association in New Zealand, was on calls every day with various parts of government involved in designing the various responses that we were trying to put together quite quickly to deal with such an unusual event.
And when did it start to deteriorate from a government business interaction point of view?
Look, I think the first Auckland lockdown was the first time that we saw a response that was, to be perfectly honest, chaotic. It wasn't driven by the same process and system that had dealt with the first national response. Instead, it was driven out of Wellington, driven by somebody in the Ministry of Health who led it. And as someone who had been the CEO of AT and used to sort of running big events and dealing with lots of big logistical issues in the city, it didn't tap into any of that experience. I don't mean my personal experience, but even any of those processes. And it felt like it was just being made up as we went along. I was part of a group of Auckland, business leaders or who were coming together to respond to that. And to be perfectly honest, it was sort of a mixture of horror and humour that we dealt with every day, as there were announcements made around things that were completely logistically impossible, And then there were also sort of, really curious things like, why would you put a boundary to Auckland on the Bombay Hills and have, legions of traffic lined up? And I suppose that culminated, in being involved with the debrief, because I made my concerns pretty vocal with the Prime Minister, and so Jacinda personally invited me to come to the debrief along with Kirk Hope from Business New Zealand, and it was at that debrief that the person from the Ministry of Health said, well, to be perfectly honest, we didn't realise so many people cross the border into Auckland every day, which just was such a bizarre statement, but completely explained why no one had worked out that people actually often drive from Northland through Auckland to get south and vice versa, that there were nurses and essential workers that came into Auckland every day from other places, and that there was freight and other things that help keep the economy going that were required to get over the border. And to be fair, we did see with the future lockdown some of those issues, I guess, addressed with moving the southern border to Mercer. But also there didn't seem to be a recognition that Auckland is actually a region more than a city. And it's a region it's 140 kilometres long, it's 50 kilometres or so wide at its widest point. It's the second largest rural territorial local authority in New Zealand, and yet it was just all of the responses were really dealing with what were urban issues, or perceived urban issues, overcrowding, people living in particular suburbs, rather than looking at the region holistically. And that was very, very frustrating, and unfortunately Auckland is still dealing with the fallout from those issues. Things like major projects that in Australia would have been still allowed to proceed, like the CRL and others, where here we just blanketly stop people from working, and that blanket stopping people from working slowed down our economy, which was something that we warned the government about, but unfortunately health issues prevailed.
And that was for the first lockdown?
Yep.
That was, I think, before the election, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
It was before the election.
It was.
In the election, and you made things clear to the Prime Minister that we're not happy, business is not happy. Did they do anything?
Look, I think, the Prime Minister listened to what I had to say, and her response, I think, was to get us involved with the officials. But there always seemed to be, to me, a gap between the discussions that you had with people in the beehive and actually what was happening on the ground and how it was being managed. And I could give you numerous examples of that, across multiple parts of the response. And some fundamental things never changed.
Just on that 2020 election, were you surprised that they got 50% of the vote?
Oh, look, it was a pretty strange election process, and obviously, some of the political parties involved with that had some challenges of their own. But yeah, I think for a system that was purportedly designed so no party could ever have an absolute majority, it was an astounding result, and obviously an overwhelming vote of confidence for the COVID response. For someone who was actually, I guess, on the inside of a lot of that, I actually found that quite surprising because, I'd seen a lot of that dysfunction. But then when so much of it was pitched around the mortality rate and dealing with that, that's pretty fundamental to a society. And so I could understand that people saw that it had been successful, and it was too early, quite frankly, to see some of the side effects or the impacts that it had on business and the economy, which we're still living through today.
And then after the election was 2021, and that's when frustrations started to come again. Is that when you think the turning point was, or was it earlier than that?
Firstly, when the government announced its vaccination program, and we were all assembled at a meeting at PwC, who actually played probably a greater part in actually rolling out the vaccines in the end than most people know, because they ran the vaccination program, not the Ministry of Health. ran the logistics behind it. So we were assembled at a meeting, the Prime Minister was there, senior ministers were there, and they set out, we're going to roll this vaccination program out and we want your support. And there was, Corporate New Zealand was there, I was there, along with a number of other associations. I actually asked the first question at that session, and I said to the Prime Minister, so what's the size of the prize here? Because if you want to incent people to undertake a particular behaviour, what do they get for it? So is it that once we get to an 80% vaccination rate, you're going to open the borders? Because you've got to have something to compel people, and not everyone likes to be vaccinated, as we discovered. And so the Prime Minister, in a very engaging way, said, "Well, Brett, that's a great question, and I think that's a good point to make," and referred me to a couple of ministers, and Ashley Bloomfield was there, and everyone just fluffed around it. No one answered the question. And I think we're still waiting for an answer to that question because it was never clear what the size of the prize was. And so it was very hard to motivate people to get vaccinated. I'll never get over the RAT test fiasco when Auckland did open up that. I think it was the first time the Prime Minister gave me an undertaking that we were going to be able to get RAT tests in. We had, from memory, 25 million RAT tests sitting in Sydney, RAT tests that have been approved for use in Australia, approved for use in other countries. I was dealing with one of our members that was going to bring the RAT tests in. It wasn't through Pharmac, it was through Ministry of Health. I still don't really understand why that was the case, and there's still lots of speculation as to why that was the case. And suddenly there were some Ministry of Health people who weren't working there anymore, who'd been involved in some of the procurement of the vaccines. Still don't know what happened there. And we're in Auckland trying to, prosecute to get these RAT tests into New Zealand, and I'm talking to a Ministry of Health person who's just finished work at 4:30 in Wellington and is wandering through, the botanical gardens on their way home, while Auckland is a lockdown, and we just saw the RAT tests as being something that could be used as a way of preparing people, but there was no sense. The Prime Minister had a sense of urgency and an undertaking, but there just didn't seem to be the machinery behind that to make it happen. And then, of course, when finally we became aware in the following January that activity was in November and December, that we needed the RAT tests, the Ministry of Health grabbed all the RAT tests, including RAT tests that we'd ordered for our members, and took them on board, and then basically lied about it and said they hadn't done that, which eventually was shown to be a lie or a mistruth. And so again, for all of our members that were involved in waiting for those RAT tests that have put orders in either in their own right or through us, that sort of thing really impacts confidence and people's belief that people are telling the truth about what was a pretty important series of events.
So why did that negatively affect Ardern then, rather than the slow machine of government?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question. Maybe that's a sign of the times, because the Prime Minister had been so prominent in leading that. I know from being in leadership roles myself, if you put yourself out there, you have to be prepared for the good and the bad. And so much of it was led by her, and so much of it was associated with her. I think, and obviously, even before COVID, she had people that weren't her political supporters. And so all of that lent to be, I guess, she was seen as the symbol of our response, and then the symbol of being taken down. And we had members of the EMA who funded their workers to go to the protests in Wellington. Members who rang me and said, Brett, I have to take responsibility every day normally for the health and safety of my workers. And now you're saying, because of this vaccine mandate, that I don't have responsibility anymore for safely bringing my unvaccinated workers on site. And that was a really interesting debate, as you can imagine. And I had to say, well, look, whether I agree with it or not, it's the only way we're going to get people back to work. Because I can tell you the Ministry of Health is so conservative about this stuff, and they will not right through the response. They would not trust individual businesses to do the right thing. There were these blanket rules. And so, those members, and we're talking, some pretty significant businesses, kept paying their workers, and in some cases, definitely a couple of cases I know, funded those workers to go down to Parliament to protest because they felt so strongly about it. So when you see a response that becomes that ingrained, you can see how the tide starts to shift, and people wanted to blame somebody. Most people didn't have the inside knowledge that I had about where some of that dysfunction lay. So when you don't know that, who do you blame? You blame the leader. And I think, we saw that writ large, and that tide turned so quickly. And in a very nasty, a way that I don't think I've ever seen in New Zealand before, for that tide to turn so quickly.
I mean, it was nasty, wasn't it, when you look at the protests and the nooses and the gallows that were outside Parliament in February 2022.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. You reflect on it now. The first Prime Minister or political leader to win an absolute majority in an MMP system not designed to give anyone an absolute majority, and less than 2 years later, resigning as a leader because of many reasons, but obviously a lot of it to do with the protests, the death threats that she was getting, and as someone who met with her reasonably regularly, you could see the strain, that it took on her through that process. So yeah, pretty unprecedented.
Was that a mistake to force people to have a medical treatment or whatever?
Yeah, look, I think the whole set of circumstances, people don't like being told what to do. People like being able to make their own decisions. I think New Zealanders historically are pretty independent people, and suddenly being told that you must do that, and effectively kind of threatening the livelihood of people's families and their ability to work. Because let's face it, some large businesses could afford to pay their workers, but a lot of businesses couldn't. And if you're a sole trader, or and so many of our businesses are small, something that we often have to remind ourselves, those people don't have a choice, because if they didn't get vaccinated, then they couldn't work, unless they could find someone as a customer that didn't care. So I just think that's at the heart of who we are as New Zealanders, because we do like to feel like we're independent, we can make those decisions. And that united a whole group of people together in opposition to the government that came from all different spectrums. Some people that were anti-vaxxers, some people that were conspiracy theorists, some people that were businesses just trying to get on, and united them in a way that probably we haven't seen maybe since something like the Springbok Tour in 1981, in terms of right across society. Obviously there have been hikoi and protests around particular pieces of legislation, still are, but that was an issue that really sort of electrified a whole lot of people that wouldn't normally come together and protest for something. So that shows you, to me, I think that it was something quite different.
If Ardern wasn't in charge, if it was a government of a different colour, would they have just struggled? Would it have been inevitable that any government would have struggled?
No, I don't think so. I think, we have been through multi-year events in the past with, say, world wars and conflicts we've had to deal with. And I think if we had treated it like a crisis from the beginning to the end, if we had maintained the original crisis and emergency management processes that we'd had right from the beginning, I think we could have got very different outcomes. But it's hard when it's over a long period of time. But we've had to do that with world wars but of course, none of us have any institutional memory of that. That's a long time ago, and obviously in many cases, quite painful memories of how. But I think a lot of the angst could have been avoided if we'd kept those processes in place and we'd kept those lines of communication going. But the moment it became a regional crisis for Auckland versus a national crisis, things changed. And the fact that all of the decisions about Auckland were ultimately being made in Wellington, in an environment where people weren't in a lockdown, I guess is not exactly best practice for issues in crisis management.
What, looking back and having lots of dealings and stuff with her, what is her legacy?
It's really interesting when you travel internationally, and I represent New Zealand on the APEC Business Advisory Council, and have some other things like my World Bowls President's role that gets me to different countries. And her name often comes up in conversation because people in those countries can't understand why she isn't still our leader. So I think those values that Jacinda still represents today are pretty universal values. And I think, the initial response to COVID, obviously the response to the mosque attacks and some of those things. I mean, I had a taxi driver in Dubai who cried in the car when he realised I was a New Zealander and thanked me for the response that we made, and said there's no other country in the world that would have done what you did, what New Zealand did, and which Jacinda led in response to that. So that's that high level, that kind of value set and that vision, which I think she was always very consistent and delivered. But they didn't live in New Zealand, and they didn't deal with the machinery that we had to deal with during COVID. And so I think people will hopefully over time remember her as someone who had the right value set, but just didn't necessarily preside over a government that managed the crisis particularly well over the length of the crisis. And I think that's the reality of what we've experienced.
And once that crisis, the acute part of the crisis scenario was over, how did she manage Auckland business in sort of the year of 2022? Because there was a lot of stuff that the government was pushing through, the TVNZ merger, the Three Waters. There was so much reform going on left, right, and centre.
Look. I think I remember, when Jacinda made her first visit to Auckland after we'd been in lockdown, and she'd been down in Wellington, and she was very keen to meet with businesses here, and I didn't realise. It was an interesting first visit that she made to a manufacturer who wasn't necessarily a big Jacinda Ardern fan. But, she listened to some of the issues that he'd been dealing with and responded in a very open way. But you definitely detected over a period of time that the weight of the criticism started impacting her, and her engagement with business seemed less confident. And often going into forums where she just didn't seem to be at ease. And mind you, if I was getting death threats, and I understand, she was getting a significant number of credible death threats over that time, I'm not sure I would have been at ease either. Then I think the other challenge was coming out of COVID. We were then hit with this wave of reforms across every area. It's like, so we've been constrained, we couldn't do stuff during COVID, and now we're just going to try and get everything done during our remainder of our time as with an absolute majority before the last election, and that seemed chaotic, as chaotic actually as some of the COVID response, and uncoordinated, and even I think even some ministers felt that, when we would challenge them on some of those things, and it felt like her lock on the government, her level of control had waned, and she's probably pretty fatigued by that stage, both physically and mentally with what had happened, and it just felt like, things were a bit of a runaway train in a number of different areas, and again, some of those issues we're still dealing with today because of the perceptions that it created around things like co-governance, which actually had been around for a long time, but was weaponised through that process. So I wasn't 100% surprised when she resigned. I think, and you know, obviously she vocalised her own reasons, but I think that you could see the pressure was telling, and it would have been very difficult to campaign in that next election with, you know, if those death threats were going to continue to exist at that volume. I don't know how you would have been able to campaign in that kind of practical sense. But I think she was just pretty burnt out, and I know what the feeling was like. I mean, I wasn't running the country, but certainly, you know, I reflect back on those times. It was hard.
There's just last question, Brett. There's an enduring vitriol towards Jacinda Ardern from some people in society. How much of that, and the hate she experienced while she was leader, how much of that comes down to sexism and misogyny?
Yeah, look, I think undoubtedly, you know, as a young Prime Minister, as someone who, you know, probably had less experience than some other people that have been Prime Minister in New Zealand before. Yeah, I think all of those things came into sharp relief. You know, I always find it so distasteful that when things go wrong, you know, people sort of play the person rather than the situation. The situation was pretty, you know, a remarkable set of circumstances, which, you know, we hope never repeat. And so taking the criticism down to that kind of level and criticising her, you know, as a woman, as a mother, and those things, I mean, that's not New Zealand. That's not who we are. We're so much better than that as a society. But and I think that just, you know, that shows, I guess, a lot about the people making those criticisms, rather than focusing on what were the real issues that were at stake and some of those challenges. And yes, you know, the government made a fundamental decision to focus on health outcomes rather than some other outcomes. And in hindsight, you know, maybe some of that was overdone, but it's very, very easy to be wise in hindsight about some of those things. As I said, I think if we'd stuck to the emergency approach, maybe it wouldn't have seemed like so much of it rested on her shoulders.
Yeah.
And I think the choice that the government made of doing the daily briefings in that way was probably didn't help.
Was that like an overexposure point of thing?
Oh yeah, I think so, and I think it just, you know, you'll remember, you know, I mean, it was the daily event, you know, what's going on in the briefings, and sometimes, you know, we found them, I guess, a little bit bewildering, because quite often what was coming up in the briefing was not what we were being told by officials, and so almost the sort of cottage industry that became the briefing. Often the briefings got in front of what was actually going on the ground, and sometimes what was going on the ground got in front of the briefings. So I think, again, if you'd had that crisis management approach, rather than the Prime Minister need to front all that, the person that was managing the crisis, whoever that might, or the group that was managing that crisis, could have been more involved. Often they were, but they were always alongside a politician, not necessarily briefing in their own right. And that's, you know, that's a political risk factor you've got to weigh up. When things are going good, that's probably a good strategy, hence the election result. When things start to turn, be careful what you wish for.